Why Nations Fail is a really interesting book, and it also raises some uncomfortable questions about where America might be heading today. Indeed, it has insights that all countries should learn from. The book starts with Nogales, a city that is cut in half by the border between America and Mexico. But over time, Nogales, Arizona in America has become a far more prosperous and safe place to live in than Nogales, Sonora in Mexico. So why do such radical differences in prosperity come about between the two halves of a divided city, between two neighboring countries? What separates the two sides of Nogales is not the people who live there, nor the geographies, nor the climate, nor the natural resources available. The only difference between the two halves is which nation state they belong to. Why does that difference make all the difference? Why are some nations so much more economically successful than others? That's the key question addressed by Daron Acemoglu and James Robinson in their fascinating book, Why Nations Fail, which is based on the research that won them, alongside their collaborator Simon Johnson, the Nobel Prize in Economics in 2024. In this video, I'm not only going to explain the key ideas in their book, but I'm also going to then link their ideas back to the politics going on in America today. So, early in the book, the authors acknowledge, discuss, but then reject what they see as the main existing theories that attempt to explain why some nations today are successful and wealthy, while others are struggling and poorer. They broadly group these explanations as being focused around either geography, culture, or ignorance. And it's not that they think that these ideas explain nothing at all, but that they focus on the wrong questions. Most economists and policymakers have focused on getting it right, while what is really needed is an explanation for why poor nations get it wrong. Getting it wrong is mostly not about ignorance or culture. As we will show, poor countries are poor because those who have power make choices that create poverty. They get it wrong not by mistake or ignorance, but on purpose. Now, to be clear, it's not as if the authors ignore the importance of historical and geographical circumstances that deeply affect a country's opportunities. For example, the book contains some harrowing accounts of how devastating and vicious colonialism was for some countries. But the question the authors are trying to tackle is why it is that two countries that had similar circumstances at one point in time can later diverge so much. And their research led them to conclude that it is differences in institutions that explain the divergence between such nations, rather than it being prosperous countries that make good institutions. They find that it is good institutions that lead a country to long-term prosperity. And their observations around institutions have a number of layers to them. The first layer is to notice how the institutional arrangements of a country have a path dependency. Where your institutions get to depends on where you started and the journey you take. So for our two countries, A and B, that start with similar circumstances and similar institutions, they note that over time there will be gradual institutional drift that builds up small but important differences between the institutions of the two nation-states. Then, when a critical juncture comes along, such as the opening of new trade routes or the invention of new powerful technologies, these two nation-states will now respond in different ways. One will be much better able to take advantage of the new circumstances. One of the examples they give of this dynamic is the divergence between England, France, and Spain over the course of the 17th century. They note that in 1588, all three countries were ruled by relatively absolutist monarchs: Elizabeth I in England, Philip II in Spain, and Henry III in France. All were battling with assemblies of citizens that were demanding more rights and control over the monarchy. However, there was some institutional drift in England because Elizabeth I was far less financially independent, so she had to beg Parliament for more taxes. In exchange, Parliament demanded concessions, in particular restrictions on the right of Elizabeth to create monopolies. So this meant that merchants in England were better placed to take advantage of the Atlantic trade routes when they started to become really lucrative. This in turn caused further institutional drift as the balance of powers shifted further away from the crown, setting the scene for the Glorious Revolution in 1688, which established in England the most pluralistic, inclusive political institutions at the time. And this set up England to be in a much better political economic arrangement to first foster and then prosper from the Industrial Revolution that followed. So let's take a look at what Acemoglu and Robinson argue are the reasons why good, inclusive institutions are the best foundations for long-term prosperity. So, a key thread that runs through all their thinking is to notice that the prosperity of a nation-state is built upon the prosperity of the individuals, families, and groups that make up the society. So anything that helps provide a context in which people feel confident to build a business, invest in their own education, and generally build and grow at the local level is more likely to add up to a prosperous society at the level of the nation-state. Conversely, if people are discouraged from investing in their own circumstances, then there is no way for the nation-state to prosper despite this. With this in mind, the next layer of their thinking is to note that for any society to truly prosper, it must have a strong, centralized state that is enforcing a legal and financial framework that people can work within. In contrast, the kind of violent tribal anarchy experienced by, say, Somalia and Haiti does not encourage people to invest in the long term by, say, growing a business, as you can assume that the militias with machine guns will soon be at your door to take control of any successful business. But of course, it then matters how this centralized state behaves. The worst scenario is for the state to be run by a small extractive elite who use the apparatus of the state to extract as much wealth as they can for their tribe from everybody else. This is slightly better than violent anarchy, because the extractive arrangements are slightly more stable and predictable, but not by much, as this scenario leaves huge incentives for those not in power to violently overthrow the current monarch, as that is the only route through which their tribe can prosper. So, an improved scenario is to have an inclusive economy that allows more groups to prosper, even if the politics is still largely controlled by a small elite. For example, a crucial step towards a more inclusive economy is to establish confident property rights that allow individuals and groups to know that the farms, factories, and indeed inventions that they are investing in won't just be arbitrarily taken away from them at the whim of the absolute ruler. Some wealth will still be collected or controlled centrally, but not all of it. But the best institutional arrangement is for the political institutions to also be inclusive, so that more of the different groups of society are having their interests reflected in political choices being made, including how the centralized funds of the state are being used, ideally to the benefit of the whole of society. And the authors aren't just saying this because pluralism is a morally superior way to run a society than absolutism. They argue that the dynamics of pluralism give societies a better chance of prospering, especially over the longer term. And I think this is the most important idea in their book. They point out that over the longer term, the real routes to prosperity come from inventions and changes in circumstances that usher in some kind of creative destruction, where older means of generating economic wealth, and thereby power, are replaced by newer means that often empower different groups within society. In an absolutist or elitist political context, those with the existing power will often use their power to ban the new technology or trading route or whatever. Growth thus moves forward only if not blocked by the economic losers who anticipate that their economic privileges will be lost, and by the political losers who fear that their political power will be eroded. And Acemoglu and Robinson give many examples of absolute leaders shutting down innovation and progress deliberately in order to retain a better grip over their society, such as Francis I of Austria in the early 1800s. When a plan to build a northern railway was put before Francis I, he replied, "No, no, I will have nothing to do with it, lest the revolution might come into the country." Indeed, he had a general aversion to all forms of industrialization, worrying, for example, that factories in cities would lead to a growing opposition to his absolute power. Instead, he wanted to deliberately keep his empire agrarian and feudal. A similar dynamic happened under Tsar Nicholas I in Russia, who also deliberately suppressed the spread of railways and factories. And the book has this fascinating map of the railway network in Europe in 1870, which shows clearly the change in density of railways as you move into the more feudal, absolutist countries that were trying to resist the creative destruction from the Industrial Revolution. In hindsight, this is such an obviously foolish move for the prosperity of those countries as a whole compared to their industrializing neighbours. But of course, it probably did keep those particular extractive political elites in power for an extra few generations. Although they didn't have the following diagram in their book, I think it can be useful to look at these aspects of political economic institutions as two dimensions, one showing extractive versus inclusive economics, and the other as extractive versus inclusive politics. And the authors often use the shorthand of referring to the political extremes as being absolutism versus pluralism. And rather than their term extractive politics, I have also sometimes found myself thinking of it being about exclusive politics, where only a minority elite group are allowed a political voice, such as in China today. Then another key observation they make in the book is how extractive politics often reinforces extractive economics, and vice versa, in a kind of vicious circle. Indeed, the authors talk about how one sad reality for many countries that were afflicted by colonial extraction is that the revolutionary independence movements that threw off the shackles of colonialism often then just took over the extractive economic institutions in a way that gave prosperity only to the local elite who are now in power. Decades later, many poorer countries today remain poor largely because their politics is still stuck in this vicious circle of extraction. It's not ignorance or geography or culture that is keeping them poor. It's their extractive elite who are effectively choosing to keep their country poor in order to keep themselves rich and in power, just like Francis I did centuries before. And no doubt there are rich countries bribing and encouraging these wealthy elite to keep these countries with an extractive economy that is useful for the wealthy elsewhere too. The authors do not deny that there is plenty of blame to go around for the state of affairs, but their point is to highlight how long-term failure of a nation is best understood as a political choice that could be otherwise. For those countries that do manage to develop institutions that enable a pluralist, inclusive politics with inclusive economics, like England after the Glorious Revolution, the authors argue there are dynamics in this quadrant that lead to a prosperous, virtuous circle that can also be quite stable. It's a prosperous place to be because it is here that the engine of creative destruction works best. It is here that fortunes can be made and lost, political power can be won and lost, all as part of the natural order of such an inclusive political economy. Indeed, this fertile interplay between two separate spheres of power, markets and politics, is precisely what Martin Wolf talks about in his book, The Crisis of Democratic Capitalism. It also reminds me of the generative, evolving nature of systems that are what Nassim Nicholas Taleb calls anti-fragile. But to show why this place can also be stable, I want to talk about two obvious risks to this kind of inclusive political economy. The first is that market capitalism has a tendency towards consolidation into monopolies that can distort the economy into an extractive racket controlled by a few rent-seeking oligarchs. But this is where strong, inclusive political institutions can resist this extraction by, for example, introducing anti-monopoly regulations, known as antitrust regulations in America, that tilt the playing field of the market back to being a more competitive, inclusive market. The second risk of political overreach towards authoritarianism can be stopped by the institutions of a genuinely free press and an independent judiciary, so that the political dynamics get pushed back into the healthy, pluralist space of liberal, inclusive democracy. And the authors give historical examples of both of these stabilizing dynamics, including from the United States. Indeed, America has been the poster child showcasing just how much prosperity can accrue to a nation when it manages to keep itself within the virtuous circle of pluralist, inclusive politics and economics. But with all this in mind, let's talk now about America today under the latest Trump administration. So, as books like Choke Point Capitalism point out, various sectors of the American economy have long been consolidating into a handful of monopolies and monopsonies, and there's a growing sense that America is at risk of heading into a new age of oligarchy. But while the previous Biden administration started various antitrust cases against some of the tech monopolies, Trump seems to be courting a more transactional, close relationship with the tech oligarchs, while the huge investments in AI seem to underpin an ever greater share of any growth in the American economy. At the same time, Trump's administration seems to be systematically dismantling the institutions of government and the traditional checks and balances that have kept these institutions as pluralist, inclusive institutions where no single person or group has too much power. That may sound like hyperbole to some, but just to give a very small set of examples, Trump has explicitly directed his Attorney General to prosecute political enemies, breaking the norm that separates the actions of the Department of Justice from the President. He set tariffs in ways that ignore the split of powers between the elected Congress and the President. He's pushed a deportation approach that has tried to deny due process to some people in America, despite how clear the Constitution is on this point. And he's deploying National Guard troops into cities against the wishes of the state governors, challenging both the balance between state power and federal power, and the distinction between the military and law enforcement. In other words, he's acting as if he believes in the unitary authority of the president to do whatever he thinks is best, rather than in the traditional checks and balances between the three co-equal branches of government and between the state and federal levels of government. Fortunately, as of today, there have been at least a few examples where the law courts and states have exerted their independent authority, and so there are reasons to think that ultimately the pluralist institutions of America will hold. But we don't know what will actually happen next, and the worry has got to be that Trump will push America into the vicious circle of an extractive, oligarchical economy controlled by an extractive, authoritarian political elite. Yes, in the short term, some favoured capitalists would no doubt make a lot of money while the existing wealth of America is captured and extracted. But over the longer term, the crucial prosperity engine of creative destruction would be diminished, as the existing owners of wealth and power would cling on to their existing systems of wealth creation. Just to illustrate the point with one vaguely plausible example, imagine that in the next 5 years or so, someone in the world develops new AI technologies that mean that it becomes cost-effective to run the best AI models on local hardware, like your latest mobile phone or laptop or whatever. So then, it may be that the best way for countries to prosper from AI would be to have a highly distributed network of local AI tools that run on your own personal hardware, giving you both high levels of individual agency over your own AI, with high levels of privacy, but also giving your society high levels of diverse experimentation and creativity compared to, maybe, the homogeneous AI slop that gets output from a centralized AI data center. Indeed, this distributed, local approach to AI sounds like a very attractive future to me, but it would radically undermine the scale of investments that are happening at the moment in data centers around the world. The logic of creative destruction sometimes results in a whole era of investments being written off. But today, America's betting the house on AI data centers, and for now, it looks like a safe bet. but an extractive oligarchy would want to lock it in as the only option. So, just as Francis I banned railways and factories, an America ruled by an extractive big tech oligarchy might use regulations and lobbying to block a distributed local AI future in America until their investments in data centers have paid off. Of course, this looks far-fetched today, but in this speculated future, America's society-wide progress and prosperity could be slower compared to some other countries whose citizens were free to quickly jump on the distributed local AI route. And of course, there are important moral reasons to prefer inclusive politics and economics in any case. But the interesting thing about the book Why Nations Fail is that independent of our political values, the authors highlight how long-term broad prosperity is at stake too. So for both of those reasons, I hope, and I'm pretty sure, that the political economic institutions of America will ultimately hold on to their independent authority and responsibility to maintain the inclusive pluralism that has made America such an interesting and prosperous country throughout its history so far. And of course, the same goes for other countries too. Inclusive political and economic institutions are good for society and should be championed and protected. But have you read the book? What did you think of their analysis? Please do continue the discussion in the comments below and subscribe if you'd like to see more videos like this. Thank you for watching.